He woke to the sound of thunder and the scent of exhaust and metal, a storm that wasn't weather but a congregation. Jonah's first thought, absurd and immediate, was that he'd slept through some funeral. The second was that the cheerless motel honeymoon he had imagined had never existed. He threw an arm over the thin motel blanket and found the weight of somebody else's body gone from the mattress, the echo of another breath absent. Gracie was gone. In the corridor outside, a dozen engines idled like predators, each growl synchronized, a library of intent. Men moved through the morning like oil, slow, precise, dangerous. The door to room 9 was cracked open, and through it he saw faces he'd never seen before but recognized like old scars. The Calder riders, helmets off, eyes like flint, and Gracie standing at their center like a weathered statue come to life. Hair braided silver, leather jacket shaped to her shoulders the way a queen's cloak hugs a throne. Her face, when she looked at him, held no softness. It held orchestration. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The sight of her took the air from him the way a hard hand can stop a clock. She had married him last night on a dare, on a stitched-together hope. He had believed, with a naive, pocketed longing, that marriage could stitch him into a family, could hang him on a wall of belonging, and keep the cold at bay. Instead, he was waking into a war council. Gracie's voice, low and dry, the voice of someone who had shouted over thunder and inked names in ledgers, cut across the hum. "Jonah," she said, like a summons and a judgment at once. "Get dressed." He sat up so fast the room swam. The cheap motel clock blinked 6:12. He had married a woman 41 years his senior on a wild impulse at the county clerk's, the kind of thing his mother would have called a mistake, his counselor a relapse. But Gracie Calder had not been a mistake in any ledger he could read. She had been a shelter and a promise of no more road, and he had reached for her like an exhausted man reaching for a rail to steady himself on a ship in a storm. He stumbled to his feet in his thrift store jeans, buttoning a shirt that smelled faintly of her perfume and machine oil. At the door, he hesitated to fold the motel sheets back to their anonymous, untroubled neatness. He had married a matriarch. The motel bed would not swallow that truth. Outside, the lot was a tableau of chrome and leather. The Calder riders were assembled in a rough semicircle around a battered picnic table. Maps were spread out on the wood, edges weighted with spare keys and a pack of cigarettes someone had forgotten to stamp out. Gracie stood with one hip against the table, ledger under her hand like a talisman. She had a pen tucked behind her ear. Up close, Jonah could read the tiny things: a faded scar along her jaw, knuckles thicker from decades of gripping handlebars, and something old and metallic, bullets or belt buckles, embedded beneath the skin. She looked at him, then to the men, then back, and there was that unreadable line where affection should have been. "This is Jonah Reyes," she said. The way she said his name made him feel as if she'd signed his fate. A prospect, young, eager, the kind of man whose jaw hadn't yet learned to hold a secret under it, stepped forward and offered Jonah a helmet as if he had been knighted. Jonah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of being handed a helmet, but the look on the faces around him forbade mirth. These men were not ornamental. They were carved by road and loss, stitched together into a living thing that remembered every slight and every favor, and they had brought their grief with them this morning. "President wants blood or answers," Gracie said low, and a hush fell. "Someone's been talking. Someone says—" She paused, the ledger flipping a page with a practiced finger. "Someone says I sold out the Calder South line to the Red Talons." A ripple passed through the assembled men like a wet wind. Accusations were knives. Accusations against the matriarch were barbed. Jonah felt, for the first time, the calculus of his own name. He had married into a ledger of debt and memory. The riders looked at him with the same interest a hawk shows a fledgling. This one had been accepted by Gracie, therefore he was relevant, therefore he should be useful. Their eyes catalogued him. They catalogued his hands, the way his fingers trembled as he tightened the helmet strap, the way his shoulders hunched. He had not yet earned the right to keep his secrets. Gracie's gaze softened for the briefest second, a moth's wing of tenderness that startled him, then hardened. "We don't do whispers," she said. "If someone has a story that can change the line of the club, we hold a council. We look them in the face. We make them explain. We don't let assholes carve wedges in our backs while pretending it's business." "And if it's lies?" a man asked, voice like gravel. "Then they pay," Gracie said. She turned and looked at Jonah again, as if measuring how deep a cut she would allow him to take. "You married me, Jonah. That means you stand with us. You need to understand what that means before you ask for breakfast." It was not a reprimand so much as the announcement of terms. He tasted iron on his tongue, and the vague metallic memory of the little ring he'd used last night as a joke when they signed the license, a cheap band he had slid on and left there like a paper marker in a chapter he hadn't read. Jonah had left home at 19 to chase a life on 2 wheels and fewer promises. He'd tried to live clean once, 3 months with a steady job, a small apartment, a girlfriend who liked thrift store art and the smell of coffee, but the stillness had betrayed him. He'd turned back to the road because the road was honest. On the road, the rules were simple. Keep moving, find shelter for the night, and don't pretend you are anyone but a man who owes favors. Gracie had offered him a ledger and a room at the Calder Clubhouse in the old warehouse by the river. The clubhouse smelled of oil, cigarettes, and coffee made strong enough to strip paint. He'd thought safety. He'd thought family. He hadn't realized family might ask him to bleed. "Jonah," she said again, softer now, and the men around them heard something like a private thread between them and fell into respectful quiet. "Your brother's name is Mateo Reyes. He's being seen with the Talons. Is that true?" The words hit him like a fist. He had left his brother behind in a cheap shared apartment, a boy with a propensity for getting bored and falling in with the wrong crowd. Jonah had used distance like a bandage to stop the ache of his own failures. He had told himself the road could be a scalpel that excised the parts of him that would hurt others. Yet here, in the ring of the riders, gripped by Gracie's steady gaze, guilt rippled through him with the force of confession. He began. "I don't know. I haven't seen him in months." Gracie's pen moved in the ledger. "If he's with them," she said, "he's an enemy. And enemies make cops and other enemies. We don't want a Reyes hanging with them." The ledger closed with a snap. Jonah thought of Mateo's laugh, the way it tumbled free in the years before police lights and burned bridges. He'd been left with a postcard from Jonah last spring. "I'm fine." His brother's handwriting had curved in the same reckless loops he'd always had, oblivious. Jonah swallowed hard and understood the geometry of choices. Where one line crosses another, someone always loses a name. A man at the end of the table, wide-shouldered, a silver streak through his mustache, spoke up. "We ride out in 40. We find out what the Talons think they know. We don't react by burning bridges. We take information or we take retribution, depending on what the Talons say when we press them." "And if they press back?" Jonah asked, because he couldn't hold his voice steady. It felt like the first time asking a question in a room of people who had decided whether you were allowed to breathe. What if they come for Gracie because she took a damn map of territory? What if they come for me because I welded my name to her? The men around him exchanged looks. One of them, a quiet man nicknamed Huck for reasons Jonah didn't yet know, reached out and touched Jonah's shoulder, the smallest of validations from a roomful of hard men. "You can leave," Huck said. Nobody's tying you to the yard." Gracie's hand caught his. It wasn't soft. It was the grip of someone who had held a steering wheel through storms and kept a ledger through betrayals. "You don't get to leave," she said. "Not now. Not if you mean to stand here with me. Marriage isn't a tux we put on for a ceremony and take off when we feel cold. It's stitches. If you pull them, everyone's incision tears." It was the first time she had spoken plainly to him about stakes. Jonah felt both naked and shielded. He had, in the space of a feverish night, signed himself to a history he did not yet know how to navigate. Gracie watched him as if she could see the lines of his past: small-time theft 2 years ago, a stint in county for a night drinking and driving, the way he had begged the judge for mercy with a voice that had been softer than the pleading of someone without attachments. She had taken all that in and still put her hand on him as if to say, "I choose this." The riders' faces were unreadable, but Jonah could sense their curiosity sharpen into expectation. They were glorious in their own way, a brotherhood that would open its arms or its jaws, depending on the proof of a man's mettle. The sound of an engine cutting out across the lot sent a change through the men like a flinch. The headlights of a black Harley washed Gracie's face, painting her in harsh contrast. For a moment, he saw the woman who had led protests and negotiated for territory and buried a lover under a willow tree in the back 40. Not the fragile grandmother he had imagined. She was a woman with more history than his mother, with a ledger that listed sins and favors spanning decades, with a reputation that had been earned in blood, in loyalty, in the unsparing arithmetic of living on the edge. Somewhere beyond the lot, sirens beat a distant rhythm. Not yet close, not yet presence. The Calder riders tightened their semicircle like a fist closing. Gracie closed the ledger and tucked the pen behind her ear. "You can leave," she said, almost to herself. "Or you can ride." Jonah looked at the row of men, at the helmet in his hands, at the woman who had married him and who now signed his name in the ledger, not with ink, but with expectation. The morning pressed in like a loaded breath. He had wanted a family, to be safe. Now he knew that safety here had teeth. His chest thrummed like an engine about to start. He put the helmet on and felt the world narrow to the sound of his breath, and the vision tunneled by the visor. When Gracie lifted her hand, the men swung their legs over chrome and rose like a tide pulled back from shore. Jonah's throat tightened. He had married an old woman, the talkers would say. He had married a myth. He had knitted himself into a club whose memory ran longer than his own life. He understood, with a clarity that scared him, that marriage had never been an escape. It was a binding. He was now part of a ledger whose margins bled into the present and whose future might demand everything he had left to give. They rode out like a single moving thing, engines harmonizing into a gut-deep chorus, the Calder patch catching the sun. Jonah felt Gracie's presence like a pulse against his hip. She didn't reach for him, nor did she need to. He had, within the span of a night and the length of a signature, been moved from the roadside into the center of a war. The realization was sharp as broken glass and sweet in a way that made his hands shake. He had asked for belonging. Belonging had come with a price. The road was a ribbon of gray under a sun that flattened everything into a glare, and Jonah's mouth tasted of metal and coffee and the memory of a decision he hadn't had time to understand. The Calder convoy moved as one animal. Chrome flashed, leather creaked like old sails, and the city peeled away behind them. Each mile felt like a stitch being pulled tighter in a seam Jonah didn't know how to mend. He kept his hands steady on the bars because the motion was honest, because wind straightens lies, and because Gracie's silhouette 2 bikes up was a constant he could measure his fear against. They rode toward the south line, where the Calder colors met the disputed lot that smelled of diesel and old promises. Along the way, the men around Jonah talked in low, economy of language ways that made him feel like a translation. Names were spoken like currency: Talons, Varga, Prospect, gone quiet, shot up a storefront. He tried to catch the cadence that would fit him, what to say, what not to say, and found himself a mouthful of silence. Every conversation had a thread that led back to Gracie, as if she were the gravity around which their lives orbited. He couldn't tell whether that steadied him or made him smaller. Gracie had not spoken much since they left the lot, but her presence was a record of its own. She rode with a spine that had been forged through years of weather and conflict, and in the way she held herself, Jonah saw the ledger again, a list of debts paid and owed, and the small, messy ink of choices that had shaped her. When she turned her head and caught his eye, it was less an invitation than an assessment, soft enough to remind him that he had been chosen, hard enough to remind him of the cost. "Remember," she said over her shoulder, voice carried by the wind and made sharp by history, "we are not here to start fire. We're here to listen, find what they think they know, and bring it back." He believed her. Belief, in the Calder world, felt like a thing you could hold and hand to someone else. It was a currency that bought favors and silence. But belief did not stop Jonah's pulse from making his helmet vibrate in sympathy. His hand bunched on the grip until his knuckles blanched. Mateo's name kept returning like a bruise. He let one thought gnaw. What if Mateo had been drawn into the talons the way a moth is drawn to light, not noticing the heat until wings were blackened? They pulled up to a dirt lot that had been a gas station once, now a skeleton of cinder block and rust. The talon's colors were there in small, messy flags tacked to a fence. A talon clawed around a skull, aggressive and cheap. A cluster of men stood like curdled weather, eyes assessing, hands brushing guns or the butts of cigarettes depending on their mood. A couple of talons noticed the Calder patch, and their shoulders went tight like a braid about to snap. Gracie dismounted slow and sure, ledger tucked in the pocket of her jacket, and Jonah felt the world narrow to the sound of her boots on gravel. She looked at the talons like a woman who had once been young enough to be stupid and had traded that stupidity for strategy. "We're meeting," she said, and it wasn't a request. The talon, who seemed to be the node of that cluster, a man with a shaved head and a scar that mapped his jawline, smiled the kind of smile that never went to the eyes. "Maddie," he said to Gracie, and Jonah flinched at the casualness of the nickname. Maddie? It was intimate, like belonging. Gracie didn't correct him. Jonah's heart did a strange staccato. When the talon leader looked at him, he gave a once-over with an annoyance that said, "New toy." "You Calder sure like your surprises," the man said. "Old lady got a thing for teacher's pet?" It was a cheap line. Jonah heard a few suppressed laughs. The talon leader stepped forward like a man keeping a balance of bravado and caution, and Gracie's pen came out like an omen. "We're not here to trade insults. We're here for answers," Gracie said. Her voice threaded through the morning air. "Someone is telling stories about me. Someone says I sold the South Line. I want to know who thinks that and why." That was the needle. The talon leader's smile didn't loosen. "Someone saying you sold it because someone saw a Calder doing rounds without a patch on. Someone saying your people moved product through South without letting anyone know. Someone saying—" He paused, eyes flicking to Jonah as if the younger man might be the rest of the sentence. "Someone saying you've started aging like the rest of us, Maddie. Maybe the ledger's getting lighter." The cut to Gracie was small but precise. Jonah saw it before she spoke, her hands flexing, the pen tightening like a fist. "Wrong," she said finally, each syllable measured. "We don't move without the books. Names, times, witnesses. We don't bargain territory with kids who think a patch's worth is decided by noise. Who told you that? Who named me? A woman Talon, short, wide, hair pulled back, snorted. Names come from mouths, Maddie. We pass them along. We're not fools. Ain't one of us says you're weak. We're saying maybe you're tired. Her tone was both dismissive and hungry. She meant tired as a code for ripe. Age, in their mouth, was a vulnerability to be exploited. Jonah felt a hot heat climb his throat. He wanted to tell them that Gracie was not weakness, that she had the ledger and the scars to prove it. But words felt small, juvenile. The men around him moved like predators waiting for the right thrust. "All right," Gracie said. "Tell me what you were told, and tell me who told you." Her pen hovered. She had made it clear that this was a methodical search, not a fight. That made the Talon's next move a test of candor. The Talon leader shrugged, as if charity had been offered already. "We heard from a Calder prospect who disappeared last month. Said Gracie sold a safe house, moved product through the South. Let the Talons work the transports when Caldermen were asleep. Said a Calder took cash and didn't blink. Said a dragon of a woman with a ledger couldn't read a map anymore." "Prospect's name," Gracie said. "Name's Luis Domingo," the man answered. "Prospect with a bad temper. He's seen here and there." Jonah's stomach flipped. He knew Domingo. He'd seen him at a stop once, one of those men who floated in and out of patches the way storms pass through town. He'd been respectful enough that Jonah had nodded once, said hello, and filed him away like a minor annoyance. Luis Domingo had been a prospect whose loyalty had the texture of smoke. If Domingo had been the mouth of this rumor, Gracie's ledger was being skewed by a man who liked a leverage that wasn't his to hold. "Where is Domingo now?" Gracie asked. Her voice had folded into a practical timbre. "If he's the source, we find him, and either he clears me, or he doesn't." "Last seen down at the Red Dock," a Talon said. "Hangouts. He likes to drink to forget his thinking." Gracie's jaw set. She turned to Jonah, and for once she didn't hide the vulnerability that hummed under the surface. "You know Domingo. Can you find him?" It wasn't a question of skill, it was a question of trusts and stakes. Jonah had wanted belonging, but belonging asked him to go into smoke and come back with answers. "We ride," she added. "Two of you go, you and Huck." Huck nodded, a hard little motion. Jonah felt the weight of that nomination like a sanction. Gracie had picked him, a choice that could be either kindness or a way to expose him to the club's truth. He swallowed. "I'll find him," he said. His voice cracked on the word, and he hated the sound. But he had no clever way of backing out. The pact of marriage had braided him into consequence. Besides, he couldn't bear the idea of someone accusing Gracie and letting that accusation sit like a poison. They split into tandems. Jonah rode with Huck, the man as quiet as a hinge and twice as necessary for support. Huck didn't talk much, but his presence was a steady thing. "You okay?" he asked at one point, the question more a courtesy than an offer. Jonah let himself be honest in the only way he could. "I don't know if I'm brave enough." The words came out too loud for his helmet, and the wind carried them away. Huck's laugh was a small, dry chortle. "Bravery's an action," Huck said. "You'll do something brave before you're done. Just don't make it dramatic for no reason." Jonah wanted to say that his brother might be in the web the Talons had cast, that Mateo's laugh had once been a thing that cut through the worst of his nights. He wanted to say he'd left a trail he could follow, that maybe he could find Mateo and pull him out of the radius of what was coming. But when he opened his mouth, a different thought came instead. That he had married a woman older than his mother for the shelter of her ledger, and now he was tasked with proving he deserved the shelter. The irony tasted like copper. They found Domingo at the Red Dock, a half-constructed pier that smelled of tar and old beer. He was flanked by two men who made it clear he had protection of a sort. Not powerful men, but enough to complicate a talk. Domingo's eyes lit up with the kind of recognition that tastes like opportunity. "Jonah Reyes," he said, as if the syllables were worth coin. "Tiny Jonas with a matron. Didn't think you'd come back past the billboard." "You tell Talons I sold the South Line," Jonas said, without preface. The sea scraped the pilings like a fingernail. Domingo's face reshaped into something like a grin. "Says you did. Says you took cash and let their trucks pass. Says matron's got too many gray hairs to keep track." "Who told you that?" Jonah demanded. Domingo shrugged. "A Calder sees a band playing. He says what he sees. We all like a story of a patch selling out. Makes the day lighter." He took a long pull on his beer and looked at Jonah like someone studying a new game piece. "You married an old woman, didn't you? They all do one stupid thing when they're broke for warmth." Jonah felt the heat crawl up his neck. "Did you make this up to rile us? You know what a rumor does in this valley." Domingo's grin spread. "Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But if your matron can't keep her house, someone's gonna take it. You and your girl want peace? You pay. If not, well, the Talons love a free line." He laughed then, a sound that had no brotherly memory in it. It was a throwdown disguised as condescension, and Jonah understood it was an attempt to show him where he stood. A new name and an old ledger, young and soft enough to be an opening. He wanted to shove the man into the water and be done with it. He thought of Mateo and the way small choices widen into dangerous arcs. Instead, he kept his hand steady and chose words like a slow hammer. "If you keep saying things you don't know to be true," he began. "Well, hear from you," Huck finished, his voice like the click of a loaded lock. His posture was a promise, not a threat, and Domingo's grin faltered. Domingo's eyes flicked to Huck and then to Jonah. "You Calder kids are serious," he said. "Fine, I was the mouth. I said it. But I wouldn't be stupid enough to come straight to you if I wanted to try cashing in. But if it gets you in the street, fine. Take it. Make of it what you want." They left the red dock with Domingo's words swirling like ash. The Talons had a mouth. Someone had used it. Jonah rode with anger seeping in, a careful, hot tide that made his fingers ache on the bars. Gracie's ledger had been slandered, and though Domingo had admitted to spinning a tale, the fact of the story's life mattered. Stories, once alive, are hard to kill. Back at the lot, the riders convened, and Gracie listened to Jonah's report with her face like a ledger. He told the truth. Domingo had been the mouth. Domingo had been opportunistic. Gracie's pen tapped her lip like a metronome. "We need to make sure Domingo doesn't get a louder echo," she said. "We do this by seeing who he told. We do this by looking at the routes. If anyone moved product through the South without a Calder seal, we find it and show the ledger." Her eyes found Jonah, and for a fleeting second they were soft with gratitude. "You came back." He felt something like relief and a smothering tide of responsibility. They set patrols. They checked manifests. They questioned men who wanted to be anonymous heroes. The town watched, and in its watching there was gossip. And in gossip there is always a price. Jonah began to understand the art of being in a club. It was not always about fists and fights. Sometimes it was about paperwork, about quietly proving who you were through small, stubborn acts. The ledger mattered because it was proof. The ledger could kill a rumor as surely as a gun could kill a man, if used with patience. Night came, and the riders returned to the clubhouse with little answers and smaller victories. Domingo's trail thinned. No one wanted to be the one to escalate, and both clubs smelled that caution like a medicine. But the sense of unease hadn't lifted. Rumor had a way of reproducing itself in darker corners. Gracie moved through the clubhouse like something that had always been home there. And Jonah watched as men he had never known folded themselves into a quiet obedience around her. They asked him small questions now, about where he'd lived, whether he'd been vetted, and he answered enough to keep them calm. Every answer felt like a stitch. In the privacy of her office, an old converted bathroom with a desk carved from a door and a Davis ledger open like a maw, Gracie looked at him with a tired intensity. "You could leave," she said, softer than she had been all day. "I won't stop you. If you feel you've been put in something that will swallow you, you can go. I've been choosing to stay my whole life. That's my burden." Jonah sat on the edge of a rusted chair and felt the weight of the day like a bruise. He thought of his mother, of Mateo, of the way his life had folded in upon itself until marriage seemed like a lifeboat. He had come wanting safety. Now he knew safety at the Calder table meant knowing the knives in the kitchen. "I can't leave you with this," he said. "Not after today, not after Domingo. I don't know how to do the ledger, but I can learn. I can watch the lines. I can do the small things. I can be useful." Gracie's mouth quirked, almost a smile. "Useful is better than pretty," she said. "Useful keeps men alive." He laughed then, the sound breaking like a brittle thing. "Is that what this is? A war of ledger and muscle?" She shook her head. "It's always been ledger and muscle. The ledger keeps the muscle honest. The muscle keeps the ledger on the table." Her fingers traced a name in the book without looking. "There are men who will call my age a problem. There are men who will try to use that as rope to hang me. And there are men, Jonah, who will try to use you as bait." He felt cold again at that, a different cold. Bait. The word clanged. "Do you think they'd use me because I'm married to you? Because they'd see marriage as a soft place?" "They might," she admitted. "But a man who scatters when he sees teeth isn't mine, and maybe you aren't either. Prove me right." He promised the ledger he'd try. He promised Gracie, in words that felt earnest and ridiculous, he would not run. The promise landed between them, small and suddenly heavy, like something that could not be taken back. Outside, engines hummed like a low pulse, the world waiting. Jonah had married a woman who had iron in her bones. He had signed into a story that would demand blood and ledger keeping. It would not be polite. There would be nights when he would want to run, mornings when he would want to choke on coffee in anger. But there was also the way she looked at him now, not as an ornament, but as a man she had chosen, and that made the risk take on the shape of a promise. They set watches that night and checked manifests again. The Talons moved like restless ghosts at the edge of town, discontent and hungry for rumor. Jonah lay on a cot in the back room of the clubhouse and listened to men breathe like sleepers on a ship. He thought of Mateo's laugh and of Domingo's grin, of Gracie's ledger, and of the way marriage had turned his life into a line on a page that someone else now read. He thought of what it meant to stand still when the world was asking him to prove himself. Somewhere between exhaustion and a kind of purposeful fear, he decided that belonging would not be handed to him on a napkin. He would earn it. The storm that had woken him that morning had not broken. It had merely circled, waiting for wind. And Jonah, who had sought shelter from the road in the arms of a woman old enough to have outlived half his mistakes, felt the first sharp clarity of what his new life demanded. Not silence, not surrender, but a readiness to be pulled into the fray, to speak where silence would be cowardice, and to stand where his new family needed him most. The ledger had placed a mark beside his name. Now he would have to figure out how to write the next line. The knock came at 2 in the morning, soft enough that it could have been the branch of a tree against a window. But in a clubhouse where every small sound carried like gossip, it landed like a verdict. Jonah rolled off the cot with his heart already pounding a rhythm he recognized, too sudden, machine-like, and met Gracie at the office door, where she stood as if she had been carved from night itself. Her jacket was back on, ledger tucked inside as if it were armor, and her eyes were a bright, dangerous clearness he hadn't seen when they were surrounded by the men at daybreak. "Who is it?" he asked, the word thin. "Someone who talks in whispers and believes in loud consequences," she said. "Come." They opened the back door together into a winter breath of air. Under the sodium lights, the lot made shadows like a troop of giants. Two figures waited by a bike, faces half hidden by the cowl of hoodies and poor lighting, the kind of geometry you'd see near a crossroads where a deal could turn into a funeral. Jonah felt every muscle tense. He was married to the woman who kept ledgers, and now stood at the edge of one of the ledger's pages where ink meant action. "You're late," Gracie said, voice cold as river glass. The taller of the two men stepped forward. Up close, Jonah recognized the features. Coarse, sharp, the kind Luck hadn't softened. A face he had seen in a photograph once, a kid on a wanted poster in a precinct clipboard he'd once glanced at in a diner years ago. Mateo's laugh had stopped being a sound you'd hear on a cheap answering machine. This man looked like the shadow version of a boy he'd lost. "Jonah," Mateo said, and the name fell between them like a confession. Jonah felt heat crawl under his skin like blood finding a nick. "Didn't expect you'd sell out so fast." The world rearranged itself around that sentence. Mateo's presence was a blade in the ledger. Someone Jonah had hoped distance had dulled, now standing in the open like proof that some ties never quit tugging. Jonah's knees wanted to give out, but Gracie's hand on his elbow steadied him. Not gentle, but firm enough to warn him that if he swayed, she would not catch him. She would let him fall and measure how he landed. "What are you doing here?" Jonah asked, voice a brittle thing. Mateo's mouth curled. "Came to see the brother who married the matron." The barb wasn't subtle. Behind him, the other man, a prospect Jonah had seen with Calder colors once, Luis Domingo, watched with a smile that had teeth and no warmth. Jonah's stomach knotted. The two men looked like they had rehearsed this scene in 1,000 small humiliation steps. "You're with the Talons?" Jonah demanded, not because he wanted the answer, but because he needed the rope of the accusation to be visible, to knot into something solid he could hold. Mateo's laugh was a thin thing, like a rusted hinge. "Who told you that?" Mateo asked. The question was a dart. "You think everyone you left behind just sat, waiting with punches for you to come home and apologize? I did what I had to do. You always ran, John. Now you want to judge?" Gracie's jaw tightened. She had been still, patient, a ledger gathering facts. Now her pen was a knife. "He married into this club," she said quietly. "You dragged your name near ours, Mateo. That makes you our problem if you bring the Talons close." Mateo's face shifted then, from cheap bravado to a weariness that did not fit the swagger of a Talon recruit. "You pick a woman who keeps the club's books and tell me I need to be careful around rumors?" he said. "You think this ledger is a shield? You think marriage makes you family? Maybe you're right. Maybe I came to see what you sold yourself for." A new, smaller fracture opened in Jonah, an intimate, sharp pain where affection used to sit. He had fled to the road and returned to a woman who had offered a ledger as shelter, and now his brother stood as a living accusation that he had abandoned more than a hometown. "I didn't sell you," Jonah said, throat dry. "I came back because I thought—" He couldn't finish. Gracie's face moved to something between pity and calculation. She had chosen to stand with him, and yet here was an old bloodline dragging his choice into mud. Domingo's grin widened. "A Calder and a Reyes," he said to the lot, loud enough to draw a man from the far corner. "Romance with benefits, huh? You know what the Talons think. You sell, you take cash, you get old. You bring a boy as cover." The phrase cut like a bell. The men at the clubhouse edged closer, the quiet mutter of engines like breath held. Jonah felt as if he were being examined. Each syllable the men used measured him for usefulness. Had married Gracie in a flurry, reckless, hopeful, and now the reckless had been read as a weakness, something to be exploited. "You're lying," Gracie said, a clean and cold sound. "We don't sell safe houses, we keep the line." Her hand found Jonah's for an instant, less a comfort than an assertion that they were bound now, stitched in place whether he liked it or not. "Tell me what you want, Mateo. Say it plain." Mateo looked at Jonah like a map with burned edges. "I don't want this war," he said finally, voice softer but with an undercurrent that tasted of fear. "I don't want to be used. I told some men you sold out because I wanted them off my back. They think I helped them. I'm a piece in someone else's plan. You thought you could marry and buy a road off the ledger. You can't, John, not with me around." The confession landed like a hand on Jonah's shoulder that was both pinch and release. Mateo had lied, then feared the consequences enough to lie more. The Talons, the Calder, Gracie's ledger, all of it existed in a dangerous feedback loop. Accusation begets reaction. Reaction begets accusation. Jonah felt small and furious. "You could have talked to me," he said. "You could have come home." Mateo's eyes flooded, not with remorse, but with a kind of old hurt. "You left," he said. "You left me to find my own way. I found men who gave me a place. Don't pretend your marriage fixed that." Gracie stepped forward, closing the thin gap like a judge arriving. "Then help fix it now," she said. "Stop feeding names to men who use them like bullets. Tell me who you told. Tell me everything you know about who wants the South Line. We end this by clearing the ledger, not by making new stains." Mateo's face hardened. He glanced at Domingo, who gave the slight, conciliatory shrug of someone who had played his part and expected reward. "I told the Talons the South Line had been sold," Mateos admitted, voice steady. "But I didn't think they'd believe me. They promised protection. I needed that. I never meant for this to be a war." The words hovered, raw, exposing the way fear can make people barter names for protection. Jonah's anger cracked into something warmer, pity and rage tangled, because he saw the boy he'd been, all the ways he'd wanted safety without consequences. "You could have asked me," Jonah said, turning to his brother. "We could have talked. I'm not who you think I am." Mateo's laugh was a single, painful sound. Maybe, maybe not. He moved back toward the bike as if his admission had absolved him. The lot behind him brimmed with watchful men, and Jonah realized how close the club was to the point where forgiveness becomes weakness. Gracie's pen tapped the ledger, a small sound that seemed to throttle the night's tension. She looked at Mateo and then at Domingo, and spoke not as a matriarch, but as someone who had seen the same chaos play out differently 100 times. "This ends," she said. "Mateo, you stay the night. We will watch you. We will ask questions. If you lied to keep yourself safe, we will see whether you can keep the club safe in return." Domingos. She turned to the man who'd prodded the night's fractures. "You keep your mouth closed in town. You spread rumors out of greed, and you pay." Domingos's grin faded into something guarded. "I'm no coward," he said, but the bravado had the brittle edge of someone counting chips that might vanish. The men around them murmured agreement that sounded like a gavel. When the two men left, the lot did not breathe easy. The fracture remained, a thin line through the company of men, the space where trust once lay. Jonah watched Mateo mount his bike, then look back at him with a face he couldn't read. "Don't pretend to save me with a marriage, John," Mateo said, then drove off into the dark, taillight blinking like a wound. Inside, the clubhouse hummed with a quieter, angrier life. Men folded into whispers about loyalty and testing, and whether a ledger could blot out sin. Jonah felt the weight of Gracie's choice. She had called Mateo's bluff, kept him close enough to watch. She had protected the club by making a prison of proximity, a measure of control that was both compassionate and a cage. Jonah understood with a cold clarity that secrets did not die, they festered, and fractures, once opened, demanded work to close. Gracie moved to the ledger and wrote Mateo's name with long, deliberate strokes, adding a note to find who else had been told. Her hand did not tremble. Jonah placed his palm over hers, not to stop her, but to show he would be there when the ledger needed a second witness. "You lied to keep yourself safe," he said, not accusing, only naming. "But I'm here." She looked up at him, ledger between them like a shared heartbeat. "Then be here when it counts," she said. "Not for appearances, Jonah, for the truth. The club can't be held by shadows and lies." He nodded, feeling the new, fragile thing between them. Marriage had begun as shelter. Now it was a knife edge of mutual responsibility. Secrets had been pulled into the open. Fractures had formed. Repair, if it would happen, would be slow and probably painful. But as Gracie closed the ledger and tucked the pen behind her ear, Jonah realized something that steadied him. The club kept its own scared, messy vows. If he wanted in, he had to stop running from the parts of himself most likely to break other people. He had to show up, even when the truth meant blood and bargaining. Outside, a bike cut through the still night, and the warm, dangerous hum of the Calder patch leaned into the promise of watchfulness. Inside, Jonah and Gracie made a plan. Patrols to keep the Talons honest, a ledger update to track names, and a guarded decision to keep Mateo close but contained. The fracture between brother and brother had not healed. It might never. But it had been revealed, and revelation was the first cruel step toward any kind of repair. The first shot cracked like a bell over tinder. Engines went dead, a silence so sudden you could hear the air change its mind. Jonah had a second to see the flash at the lot's edge, a headlight cut, a Talon's hand rising, and then everything he'd promised Gracie and the ledger boiled into a single motion. "Down!" Gracie hissed, older voice sharp as flint, stepping between Jonah and the light as if she could still steer danger with a ledger tucked to her ribs. He lunged forward without thinking, the reflex of a brother who'd left and was finally learning where to land. A bullet bit the gravel near his boot and spat stars at his knees. Heat rush drowned his ears. The taste of iron pooled at the back of his throat. He grabbed Gracie's jacket and shoved her behind the picnic table like he'd been born knowing how to hold a life worth saving. Huck was on the other side already, a steady wall of muscle and older scars. The riders spilled into motion, not random but carved by years of rehearsed danger, bodies becoming shields and hands finding grips. Gracie's pen clattered on the wood, and for a breath Jonah feared the ledger would splinter under the stampede of boots. She didn't move to fetch it. She moved to pull, to guide, to assess with a calm that was both a command and a prayer. "You okay?" Huck barked at Jonah. The question was absurd in the shuddering aftermath, but necessary, like pressing for a pulse. Jonah felt the hot bloom on his forearm and realized he hadn't been grazed. He'd been hit, hard, below the ribs. Pain folded him into a quieter, sharper world. He clung to the table with both hands, while the men found angles, muffled returns of fire, and pushed the attackers back toward the fence where Talons melted into the dark like a stain being rubbed at the wrong way. Gracie's eyes were on him, not with the soft indulgence he'd once craved, but with the ledger's focus. Transactions tallied, risks assessed, costs calculated. "Jonah," she said simply, which in the Calder grammar meant both accusation and relief. Her hand went to his wound before he could tell her not to, and the touch was rough, practical, and so fierce it was almost a caress. "You idiot," she whispered, voice small in the chaos. Then louder to the men. "Hold the line, take the road, don't let them pull us into a slaughter." They did. They pushed with quiet, efficient brutality. The Talon who'd fired ran for a bike and found Huck waiting. The exchange was brief, ugly, final. Men who'd been strangers hours ago moved with Jonah's blood on their boots like a covenant. The firefight cleared in less time than it takes to decide what you'll regret. Breath came back into the lot in ragged pulls. The ledger lay open on the picnic table, a page turned by violence, ink smeared with dust. Jonah tasted victory and copper. He wanted to laugh, to cry, to curse the world and kiss Gracie until both of them forgot the cost. Instead, he breathed and felt her hand press a rag into his side, the heat of her palm an anchor. "Stay with me," she said, and the words weren't a plea, they were a claim. He stayed. He heard Huck's voice roll through the men with orders, reports, checks, moves to close gaps. They gathered wounded, counted heads, and drove the Talon rumor back into the gutters where gossip belonged. Mateo, who had been an open wound between brothers, hovered at the edge like someone realizing the shape of his consequences. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He helped pull men to cover, hands as clumsy and guilty as Jonah's. Gracie didn't leave his side. She barked words to medics they called, ordered a rider to fetch a doctor, and, between commands, kept telling Jonah to breathe, to hold still. Each time he thought he might lose the thread, her fingers tightened, and he remembered why he'd married an iron-willed woman with a ledger. Because she kept accounts in a world that preferred chaos. Because she had the nerve to stand in front of bullets and tell a pack of men to behave. When they wheeled Jonah onto the ambulance stretcher, he fought to smile up at her. Blood had darkened his shirt into a map he'd never meant to chart. "You didn't have to take the bullet," Gracie said, hand clamped around his bruised wrist. Her voice broke then, a small, sharp sound that made the men step back like something private had been exposed in public. "You did," she corrected, as if the record needed rectifying. "And you'd do it again." There was gratitude, and something else, an admission that required no ink, that he'd chosen ledger over flight, sacrifice over selfishness. Outside, the lot hummed with a different kind of noise. Engines idling like hearts regaining rhythm. Men speaking in exhausted, respectful undertones. Mateo's eyes found Jonah's for a second, raw, unvarnished. Then he turned away, unable to hold the look of brotherhood and betrayal at once. The Talons had been pushed back, but the ledger had new ink, blood, and a ledger line that read, "Jonah Reyes, proof of loyalty." At the hospital, Gracie stayed until the surgeon stitched him and the doctor nodded like a judge satisfied. She wouldn't leave until Jonah's ragged breath steadied. When he woke, dizzy with drugs and small with fear, she was there. Ledger closed on the nightstand like a talisman. Her fingers folded over the book as if keeping it sealed against further lies. "You could have lost me," she said, soft as paper. "You could have run me down trying to save me. Why did you do it?" Jonah's throat hurt. He reached for her hand because it felt like the only honest thing in the room. "Because you stood in front of me first," he said, voice thin. "Because your ledger put my name next to yours. Because I couldn't bear the thought that I'd tried to buy a family and then let them fall apart." The words were unadorned, ugly with confession, and cleaner for it. She studied him like someone reconciling entries. Then she leaned down and kissed him. Brief, fierce, the kind of kiss a woman gives when she decides to keep a dangerous thing. "Then write the next line," she murmured against his lips. "Not with ink," she added, voice half smile, half command, "with whatever it takes." Jonah promised, and the promise sat between their palms. It wasn't yet purified or dramatic. It was a commitment wrung from danger and stitched with pain. He'd given a piece of his body, he claimed a heartbeat of the club. Gracie's hand found his again, fingers lacing into his like a ledger's binding. Outside the window, the Calder patch shone dull and distant. Inside, two people who had married on a dare were making a choice that would be counted in ledgers and in lives. The sacrifice had not bought peace, but it had purchased a beginning. They left the hospital at dusk, two figures stitched together by grief and stubbornness. Gracie in her leather jacket with a folded bandage at her throat. Jonah leaning on her arm like a man learning to trust a weight. The ride back to the clubhouse was quieter than anything they'd known. The engines a soft, deliberate thrum rather than a roar, as if the town itself had lowered its voice to listen to a healing. Jonah felt the stitches under his ribs like punctuation marks, each breath a reminder that promises could bruise and still hold. Inside, the men moved with a kind of reverence. Huck offered Jonah a cigarette, and then, when the younger man refused, simply lit one for himself and exhaled smoke that smelled like patience. Mateo kept his distance in an awkward orbit, hands doing the small work of a man trying to be useful without apology. The ledger lay on the desk, open to the day's violence, ink darker where decisions had bled into it. Gracie set a cup of coffee before Jonah and did not ask him to smile. She had ceased asking for illusions. They spoke of simple things at first, routes to be rerouted, watch rotations, who would speak to the Talons if they dared to grow loud again. Each plan was a thin, practical stitch that kept the wound from widening. Then, when the room had settled and the men had routed themselves to sleep like weathered animals, Gracie and Jonah sat at the small table under a bare bulb and traded smaller truths. Nightmares, the names of lost lovers, the one song that made them both laugh with memory. The ledger for once was not a wall, but a surface where they left marks for each other. A scrawled note from Gracie, "Don't ride the ridge alone," and Jonah's reply, "I'll learn the maps." They were promises made in ink and breath, both kinds binding. When dawn came early and pale, Jonah walked the riverbank alone for a while, the air sharp and clean, as if the world permitted small mercies. He watched chrome cases catch sunlight like shards of reckoning, and thought of the price of belonging. Not comfort, but consequence. Not ease, but fidelity to whatever truth the ledger demanded. He returned to the clubhouse to find Gracie waiting on the porch, ledger in her lap, pen behind her ear like a crown. She looked at him with a softness that had been earned and tempered. "We're not unbreakable," she said simply, "but we are stubborn." He sat beside her and rested his head against the curve of her shoulder, feeling the steady beat there. Tough, measured, a heart that had kept accounts of sorrow and kept going. "Then we'll be stubborn together," he answered. "I'll keep the ledger with you. I'll learn to read the maps." She smiled, a small tilt that rewrote age and myth. "Then write every night," she said. "Ink the truth. Let the ledger remember mercy as well as debt." They watched the river move, a slow, honest thing that neither patch nor rumor could claim. Around them, the riders would wake and tie their boots, and the town would spin its own whisper-laden stories. But Jonah and Gracie had chosen, in the raw aftermath of bullets and confession, to stay. Marriage had been a dare. Now it was a craft they would hone, sometimes with stitches, sometimes with blood, often with coffee and ledgered apologies. Above the river, a gull cried, and Jonah thought it sounded like a vow. He threaded his fingers through Gracie's and felt, finally, that belonging did not erase fear. It taught him how to keep watch for the people he loved.